Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. Now today, right, I'm coming at you guys with a new video. I just finished reading the entire story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, and let me tell you, man, that story is it's a real tearjerker, right? I was reading it and I just couldn't help but feel bad for Joseph. Now I think this story illustrates a lot. Time and time again, we think we're looking at these stories, right, 2020 vision, right? We assume, oh, they just had life good, right? They followed God and just everything went according to plan, which honestly, in a way, it did. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't hardships that came along with it, right? Things we could take for our own lives. Now, sometimes we think, man, how come things just are going this way, right? And we think, maybe God's not hearing our prayers, right? Surely, probably even Joseph thought like that, right? As I will show to you guys what happened in his life, right? The events that happened in his life were affected him, right? Now Joseph is the oldest son, born to Jacob from his second wife Rachel. Now Jacob had two wives, one of whom was Leah. They were both sisters, mind you, right? Leah was the oldest sister, and Rachel was the younger sister. But Jacob actually loved the younger sister more, right? Rachel. Now Joseph was the eldest born to Jacob and Rachel. Then they had a second son, whom was Benjamin, the younger son, right? Because Jacob favored Joseph more, his brothers were jealous of him, right? Like they didn't like him because they were jealous of him. They're like, man, he chooses him over us. And it didn't help matters when Jacob gave Joseph like a colorful sweater, right, in front of his brothers. They really resented him for that, right? Like they did not like Joseph at all. And Joseph ended up coming to them, right, and he told them a few dreams that he had, right? And one of the dreams he told them was, oh, I had a dream that the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, to put it into perspective, there was 12 children of Israel, right, of Jacob. And obviously, when they heard this story, they're like, oh, so the stars symbolize us brothers, right? So what, we're going to bow down to you? And even Jacob, when he heard this story, right, his father, he kind of rebuked him because he told him, what, is your mother and your father and your brothers supposed to bow down to you? So the time passes where Jacob's brothers, Joseph's brothers ended up, deciding, you know what, we're just gonna kill him, right? They meet him out in the field. They're out in the field and they see their brother coming. They're like, we're just gonna take him out. Their other brother, right, their oldest brother, Reuben, he tells them, no, like, let's not do that. Like, he told them, let's just throw him in a hole and then we're just gonna, just leave him, like, but we're not gonna touch him, just throw him in a hole. But he said this in order to kind of just trick him, so later on he would go into the hole and bring him out. I don't know what happened during the events, but Reuben ended up leaving somewhere, and while he was gone, the brothers were like, you know what, like they saw a band of Ishmaelites right now. The Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael. Now Jacob, his father, right, Isaac, that was his half brother. Now Isaac's half brother was Ishmael, and then Isaac had a son, and then his sons was Jacob, right? And then these are his descendants, right? So they ended up selling him to the Ishmaelites. Now the Ishmaelites end up selling Jacob into slavery in Egypt. A man in Egypt ends up buying Joseph, and he pretty much buys him as a slave. And the Lord actually, believe it or not, he ended up blessing Joseph to the fact where I guess you will call him his slave master, ends up putting him in charge of his entire household, because he saw how his pretty much his household was just blessed through Joseph, because the Lord was with Joseph. Time passes, right, and obviously Joseph is loyal, right, to his I guess you will call it his master, right? And it so happens that it says that Joseph was, he was handsome, he was well built. He was a handsome man up to this point, right? And it says that the slave owner's wife ended up pretty much lusting after him. Like, she would tell him, like, oh, come to me, right? But Joseph remained strong. He's like, no, I'm not. How could I sin like that, right? Especially to my God. How I'm not gonna do that. And I guess through over the course of time, right, which I would assume it was many years, she would just keep bugging him, and he would not give in, right? And one time he was doing some work in the home, right, which she seized him by his coat, I guess, and he like got away, but she ended up keeping his coat. She was obviously scorned because he was rejecting her. She ends up screaming, I guess, and the slaves come, her other slaves come, and they're like, what happened? And she's like, oh, this guy, he tried to do something to me, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. Then she waited with the coat next to her while her husband came. And when he came later on during the day, she told him what he was attempting to do to her, right? Supposedly Joseph. Obviously, this was a scorned woman. The guy believed it, and he threw Joseph into jail. Now, in the time when Joseph was in jail, again, the Lord was with him. So the guards ended up putting him like above the other inmates, right? Kind of like making him the overseer of the other inmates. Eventually, two of Pharaoh's, I guess what would you call them, like servants, end up being arrested, right? And that night, both of them ended up having dreams, and they were disturbed of their dreams. They didn't know what it meant. So Joseph, he saw them, and he's like, why are you guys, sad? So they both told him their dreams. The first one, he told him his dream, and then, because he was a cupbearer for Pharaoh. So then he told him his dream, and then Joseph told him, oh, well, the dream pretty much means that in 3 days, you're going to go back and you're going to be the cupbearer again to Pharaoh. So that was good news. Then the other one tells him his dream, and then pretty much Joseph gives him bad news. Like, oh, your dream means that you're pretty much going to be taken out. And sure enough, those things come to pass. But Joseph told the first one with the good news. He told him, oh, when it comes to pass, just remember me, right? And speak good word for me for Pharaoh. Happens that he forgets. He totally forgets. He ends up being restored to his the cupbearer to his position, right? But he just goes on with it, like he forgets all about it, right? It says 2 years pass, and mind you, Joseph is literally in jail. So imagine what he's thinking, like, man, like this guy completely forgot about me. Like I'm literally sitting in jail for something I didn't even do. I was sold into slavery by my own brothers. Like, he had it rough. It wasn't like it was just all peachy, right? He was going through it, I'm sure. So come to find out later on, 2 years later, after the cupbearer was restored to his place, the Pharaoh ends up having 2 dreams, and nobody could decipher what those dreams are. The cupbearer remembers, and he's like, oh, there was a guy that had told me, that I was going to be restored, and what was going to happen to this other guy, and everything he said came to pass. Like, he could decipher what your dreams are. So Pharaoh brings Joseph, and he tells him like his dream and what it means. And Joseph tells him like, oh, well, pretty much both of your dreams are related to one another, right? One of the dreams is saying that there's going to be good harvest for 7 years. It's going to be bountiful harvest for 7 years. But then after those 7 years, there's going to be a great famine where like it's going to be really bad. So he advised Pharaoh like, oh, why don't you put somebody like an overseer so that when the good harvest is good, like you manage it so that you're able to not starve during the latter 7 years, right? And Pharaoh pretty much was like, who's wiser like than him, right? Like who would be better suited to, such a task? So he put some second in charge pretty much over all of Egypt. He pretty much put some in charge. He's only second to Pharaoh himself, right? So the 7 years pass, right? And the good years of harvest, they end up storing a lot of grain for the famine that's going to take place later. Sure enough, the famine starts happening, right? It doesn't just affect Egypt, it starts affecting other lands in Canaan, where his brothers and his father are living, right? So they tell, Jacob tells his sons, right, like, go to Egypt and buy grain for us, right? So I know that they're selling over there. So they go to Egypt, and when they go to Egypt, the person in charge is obviously Joseph, their brother. And when they get there, right, he recognizes them. He recognizes them right away. So he starts kind of messing with them, right? He tells them like, oh, why are you here? And then they're like, oh, we're children of, we're all brothers, right? We're all children of one man. And we have a younger brother, and the other brother is no more. And because mind you, I forgot to mention this part. When they sold them into slavery, they went back and they told their father, right? They took his coat that he had given his son Joseph, and they pretty much tore it and they covered it with blood. So the dad actually thought that their brother had been eaten by an animal, right? So he mourned for him, right? He thought his son was gone. So Joseph starts kind of messing with them, right? He starts telling them like, "No, I don't think that's true. What you guys are telling me, I think you guys are spies." And they start telling them like, "No, we're spies. We're like honest men and this and that." And then Joseph tells them, "No, like." He puts them in jail for like 3 days, right? And then he finally tells them like, "Look, you guys can leave, but one of you guys is gonna stay behind until the other of you guys go and fetch your younger brother, so that your story confirms what you guys are telling me. So I know you guys aren't spies." So they end up doing what he tells them. They buy grain from him, right? Well, it comes to find out that Joseph ends up telling the servants like, "Oh, when you give them the grain, make sure you put the money that they paid for the grain, put it back into their purses," right? So they didn't know this. So when they're on their journey back home, like a day's in journey back to Canaan, they end up finding their gold, their silver, right, back in their pouches. So they get even more scared. They're like, "Oh my goodness, like our brother's in jail. We have to bring back our little brother, and now they're gonna think like we're stealing." So they end up going back. They tell their dad what happened, that they need to take their younger son. Now, the younger son is the last son that he has of the wife that he loved, right? Because in his mind, Joseph is already dead, and Benjamin is his baby, his last child of Rachel. So he's like, "No, like they already took one of my sons is already gone, Joseph." Now he's like, they took my other son that's being captive now. He's like, "There's no way I'm gonna give up my third son." So they kind of just like dug it out. Like they just leave the other one in captivity, right, for a little bit. Eventually their food supply runs short again. Their dad Jacob tells them like, "You guys need to go back to Egypt, right, and buy more food." But his sons tell him like, "Oh, we can't go back. The guy told us, right, that Joseph, he told them, right, that you guys won't see my face again until you bring your younger son." So the dad pretty much, he gives in, right? He ends up telling them like, "Okay, like take your brother with you, right? But like if something happens to him, he's like, I'm like, your father is gonna," because he's already old at this time. He's like, "Your father is gonna pretty much go to his grave sorrow, right, in sorrow." So they take him back. They go to buy more grain. They tell Joseph, right, like, "This is our youngest son." And it says that when Joseph saw him, he wept, right? He wept for his brother. Now I forgot to mention the fact that when he first saw his first brothers, right, when they first went the first time, he wept as well, right? He started crying, but he went to another place and he started weeping because of, they were saying pretty much that all that stuff that was happening because of karma for what they had done to their brother, and how distressed he was, and how he was pleading with them when he was being sold into slavery. And he started crying, right? That was the first time. Now the second time he sees his youngest brother, right, Benjamin, from the same mother, right? And it says that he's like, "Oh, is this your youngest brother that you guys told me about?" And he pretty much saw him, and it says that he went away to a private room and he started weeping again. So Joseph invites his brothers and his younger brother, right, to a feast. They end up having like good food, and they were shocked because he ends up giving like a 5 times the portion to Benjamin that he did to everybody, right? So ultimately he tells one of his servants, right, he tells him, "Oh, give them a bunch of grain for their family, right, to take back, and put the silver that they're paying, right, put it back into their purses," right? I mean, he's like, "Put my silver cup in the bag of the youngest child," right? So that's what they do. They end up leaving. Then he tells them, "Oh, when they're like halfway gone, he's like, follow them, and then pretty much tell them, why did you guys steal from, my master?" And then that's what they do, right? Then the children are like, "What are you talking about? Like, we didn't take anything." Like, and one of them even tells them like, "Oh, if any of us took from our master, then," he's like, "Oh, then whoever took it, he shall die, and then we shall become your slaves." So that's what they start searching, right? They start searching from the oldest child all the way to the youngest. Once it comes to the youngest child, right, to Benjamin, it says they found the silver cup. So when the brothers saw this, they tore their clothes, right? And they were like, "What?" Like, so they end up going back to Egypt, and then pretty much Joseph tells him like, oh yeah, you guys, the one that's gonna be a slave is gonna be him, right? And you guys could go. Obviously, the other brothers start speaking up. They're like, no, like we have promised our father, like, you know what, like this is only son that like left from his other wives. So like, there's no way we could go back like that. Like it would destroy our father, right? Like we don't want that to happen. And then it says that Joseph had enough. He starts weeping again. He starts telling them that he's their brother, right? That they have sold into Egypt. And he tells them like, do not distress yourself or do not be angry with yourselves, right? He's like, for this was God's doing, right? So you see how he's able to see the silver lining and seeing, you know what, even though he suffered a lot, right? Mind you, he was sold into slavery at 17. When this is happening, he was already 39 when he finally saw his brothers. 39 years, imagine, 17 years old. Think of all the hardships that he went through, right? And how times he was in prison and when he was working for the other guy and this. He was literally 39 years old when he finally saw his brothers, right? And he just starts weeping and he starts telling them, he was able to see the silver lining. He's like, you know what, God meant this for good. Because he's like, you guys wanted it for evil, but he's like, God planned it for good. Because he's like, now we're saving many lives. Because if it wasn't for him being in the position where he was in Egypt, he wouldn't have been able to have this idea where it's like, let's save up grain and let's store it for when the famine comes. And then a lot of people, it wasn't just Egyptians, it was other people from other countries as well coming and buying grain from them during the famine. They would have all starved, right? Died. So you see how God was able to use him through the bad that the brothers wanted, right? But that's why I like the story, because I'm like, it shows that God had his hand in all of this, right? But also goes to show that Joseph, he wept a lot, right? Even when he says word back to his dad, right? And he tells him, you know what, this is your son Joseph, like, I'm alive, this and that. And Jacob ends up going to Egypt and he ends up seeing Joseph. Joseph runs to him and he throws his arms around him and he starts weeping for a long time, right? So it shows this person, even though he had been elevated to such a high status, even though he still obviously had a lot of grief inside of him, right? There was still a lot of, like I said, he was hurt. Even though we're looking at things 2020, right? We're like, oh, God was with them and this and that. Yeah, but you don't think there was times when he felt like, man, like, I miss my family. Like, why did this happen to me? Like, he was in jail unjustly. A lot of hardships, right? But thank God he was able to see the silver lining. And nonetheless, right, it ends in a happy ending, right? Because he ends up bringing all his family, right? All his brothers, all his their children, his father, all of them, right, into Egypt, and he ends up taking care of them, right there, giving them the best lands, and they live together, right? And it says, I think Jacob, he was like 133, something like that, when he went into Egypt, and when he passed away, he was like 147 or something like that. So he lived another 17 years in Egypt, right? So God just blessed them overall, right? But this story is a story of like perseverance, right? And really seeing the silver lining of what was going on. Yeah, a lot of suffering went on, right? Don't get me wrong. Like how this could be for us, right? Like a lot of hardships go on in our lives. But it doesn't mean that, there's not something good that's gonna come out of it later, right? We might not see it, right? But eventually God's hand will show in the end, right? That's how I was when I would see things that would happen to me. But later on, it like builds fortitude, patience, right? And this story, right, it just encourages me to not lose hope or faith, because other people had it worse, right? And God ended up pretty much restoring them, right? But comment down below, what do you guys think? Other than that, I'm out. Peace.